Okay, perfect. All right, so good morning, everybody. I'm coming from the USA bright and early. I'm glad to be able to join everyone. I'm a health science strategy and relations lead in the Office of Research for Women's Health at NIH. And if you don't know about NIH, please look into us. But again, grateful to come and speak to you guys about the integration of sex and gender into diabetes and endocrinology research, the power and promise to patients. So I just want to quickly make a statement around women's health research being redefined. So women's health oftentimes in the past has been usually relevant to or thought about as bikini medicine and only thinking about reproductive issues. Usually focusing on women are specifically different from men, and then obviously thinking about just maternal and infant health. But now we're moving towards a direct definition and thinking about health from head to toe in mind and body. So whole person health, and a whole person, a woman is obviously a whole person and not just parts of her body. I'm also thinking about focused on overall health and wellness. And then what we're going to get to today is more thinking about sex and gender aspects of disease and treatment. I also just want to highlight that when we're thinking about women's health, we're thinking about recent women's health research. We're thinking about research on diseases and conditions only in women, such as that of endometriosis, mostly in women, thinking about obviously breast cancer in that case, or definitely in women. Most diseases, or a lot of diseases, thinking about even cardiovascular disease, presents very differently in women versus that of men. And also when thinking about intersex or non-binary persons. And so I just want to also just quickly highlight the definition now from the American, and sorry, I'm coming from America, so I'm going to use them as a reference. American Medical Association just revised their definition of women's health, and it's all conditions from which there's evidence in women compared to men of different risk, presentations, and or responses to treatment, and as well as obviously reproductive issues exclusive to women. So RWH, just to kind of give you a heads up on what I do and kind of our office, our mission is enhance and expand women's health research, the inclusion of women and minority groups in clinical research, also thinking about the promotion of career advancement for women in biomedical careers. And we hope to get to that of the NIH vision for women's health, which is sex and gender integrated in biomedical research. Every woman receives evidence-based personalized care, and women in science careers reach their full potential. So today, again, obviously the main focus of our talk is going to be that of sex and gender integration, and we'll get more into that a little bit later. But before I start a lot of these conversations, I love to help people understand the definition. Oftentimes, sex and gender has been conflated and or thought about as being interchangeable, and they're not. They're actually different concepts. And so when I refer to sex, or when I make the statement of sex, I'm thinking that of the biological component of it. So it's derived from a chromosomal complement, whether that be XX, XY, which typically is either male or female, in addition to thinking about intersex, which is XO, XXY. This begins in the utero, and also it presents obviously physiological differences. It affects health from disease risk to treatment. And then I also just want to state that gender is a multidimensional and multifaceted social cultural construct that shapes roles and behaviors and stereotypes and norms and attitudes across societies over time. It's not stagnant. And so I want to also flag that for the group. And also it can change depending on which population you're talking about. So for instance, in the US, obviously we think about non-binary for some entities, being that this is an international meeting. Some people don't know or haven't heard of that terminology. And so I just want to flag that gender can be kind of fluid depending on where you are sitting. Also, obviously, gender influences how people perceive themselves and others and how they act or interact, and it begins after birth. So we're thinking about this as soon as the baby is born, it affects behavior and health. And then I just wanted to quickly flag at the top again, SABV, and when I'm saying GASV, which is gender as a social behavioral concept, they have some intersectionality as well as far as them integrating. And I'm going to get to that to the next slide. So when we're thinking about these concepts in RWH, we in our NIH strategic plan for women's health research, we have the multidimensional framework, which represents the intersection of factors affecting the health of a woman from across her life course. So thinking about from preconception all the way to older adulthood or elderly. So the biological perspective is the internal factors, and as we were just discussing sex, its influences on genetic, molecular, cellular, and physiological levels. And then when you're getting into the women in the context, there are going to be external factors, which obviously including gender, and that influences the individual, interpersonal, community, and societal levels. And all of these things actually interact. So this is a modified version of a graphic that was presented in the paper below. And here we're also just describing it. It was honestly interesting that paper was very similar to that of our framework, thinking about gender and sex, but also thinking about epigenetic modifiers, and again, the intersection between those things. So obviously sex hormones affect these things. There are sex specific gene expressions, but then also there's comorbidities. And I just want to note quickly that there are, and it's been found that there are way more comorbidities within women, especially when they age, than there are men. And then obviously there are differences in mortality. And so I just want to highlight for this group, I'm sure that you all are very familiar with this, but diabetes type 2 diabetes is more frequently diagnosed at younger age, and lower body mass index in men, but however, their most prominent risk factor, which is obesity, is more common in women. And so obesity it's I think the best thing to kind of think about this in context. So again, it's a multifaceted problem. And it's going to take interdisciplinary research perspectives on women's health across the lifespan to actually attack and, more importantly, help the epidemic come down. But there are causals are multifactorial, thinking about genetics, thinking about environment, thinking about, again, psychosocial. And these effects obviously have a diverse impact on not only health, but also disease. And it's associated with diabetes, cardiovascular disease, depression, PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome, and obviously more. So just again, highlighting the fact that obesity results in a complex of relationships between genetic, social, economic, and cultural influences. Many people have talked about these earlier today, so I won't go into depth with these because I don't want to waste this much time. I won't say waste, but I want to make sure that I have enough time to get to the point of why I think it's important for us to start thinking about studying sex and gender. But I just will later on highlight the NIH Precision Nutrition Initiative that's also kind of highlighting the importance of these issues in that strategic plan, and I welcome anyone to look into that. So there's a complex multitude interaction systems involved of upward and downward causation across multiple scales. So oftentimes we only think, and no offense to people that do this, but oftentimes we only think, okay, I'm going to look at this one gene, but there's a whole big picture and how all these things interact. And so there's a cascade of it going up, obviously. And then there's the sex effects and hormones and DNA, but then there also are different levels in which different places act. So for instance, you have the whole organism has a high level of control of the gene expression. You also have high level triggers of cell signaling. You also have the protein machinery selects and reads and corrects genes. So this is, again, very convoluted. And I just want to make sure that we also input that of gender effects, and obviously we were just discussing the epigenetic effects in this. And then obviously people's influence on their environment as well, and the communities in which they are and live in, and the social systems in which they are in. So also obesity, just to make it even more complicated, thinking about obesity, sex differences in the microbiome. In mice, you have that of the microbiome effects are affected by diet, thinking about high fat and high sugar. I know someone was talking about other different types of diets earlier this morning. Great talk, by the way. And then obviously I want to think about the sexual hormone factors and genetics. And so here, when you think about humans, you're thinking about, if you have that of obese men, they have, it's less abundance in certain specific bacteria and fungi that are in their microbiome, and it's a difference between that of obese women. And there's obviously a decrease in a BMI increase in men only. And so I just want to also highlight quickly that you have environmental factors, gut microbiome, X chromosome imprinting and inactivation, all impeding and thinking about sex differences and the metabolism. And obviously this is very important in thinking about it. So if you don't take anything else from my talk, please understand that it's extremely important to think about sex differences. Oftentimes people do not think about them, and I think it's important for us to highlight that. Let's go to the next slide. So obviously there's a global burden of obesity, and I just want to highlight that In 2015, it was shown that women bear a greater burden of this. And so this is just, I don't know if you'll be able to see it because my screen is a little bit small, so it's harder to see the different colors, but you'll see that for men and versus women, the women, they're a darker. So that's in, see if you can see this here. There is a lot darker in these particular presences, and this is going from 0.05 as far as prevalence obesity to 0.35, excuse me, which is the dark red. Obesity is increasing in everybody, but not equally. And so thinking that this is specifically US data here, in children, there were no significant trends with the data that I'm presenting here, but there were increases from 16 to 21%, from 12 to 19. Some people still consider them, depending on where you are, children, but we do not, we consider them adolescents. For men, there was an increase from 27.5% to 43%, except for Black men, which was very interesting. And then there was obviously a rapid increase in Hispanic versus white men. But for women, it was very interesting, and I thought it was extremely important to state. The severe obesity increased from 6.2 to 11.5%. And this is driven by increases in Black and Hispanic women. So it's important also just to not only think about sex differences and sex and gender, but also thinking about intersectionality, whether it be race, age, and or socioeconomic status, education, along with other factors, such as social determinants of health. So in humans, you have obesity intersects with DM, or diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and also COVID. And so these all things kind of coming together. And I just wanted to highlight, and I'm sure people know these stats, so I won't go over them in depthly, but I do want to highlight obesity as a risk factor for acute and critical care in COVID patients, especially those who are over 60. And this was not previously thought to be, it was unrecognized as a risk factor for hospital admissions and need for critical care. So I think it's important for us to be thinking about all these issues in the big picture. And so obviously COVID underscores the importance of understanding sex and gender influences on health. I just want to note quickly that it's also important to think about disaggregation of this data. So of the 55 nations that are actually reporting data on this for COVID cases, there were 28 and then 27. And then as far as the number that are actually presenting the deaths for COVID, it's 48 versus 7. For the increases. And then I just want to highlight onto the right of the slide, the death rate in the US, just again, thinking about these in multi-factors as far as age. Obviously, if you go up in age, the deaths are increasing. For men and women, the numbers, as you can see here, it usually always is the case that men are more likely to die from women. But if you, and it's not on this slide presently, but if you actually look at some data thinking about intersectionality, there are actually some data showcasing, depending on state and also depending also where, if you're in rural and or urban areas, that has a difference. So for instance, Black women are more likely in Michigan and Georgia to die than white men. So I just wanted to flag that. Another part of this is from a woman's health perspective, obviously thinking about pregnancy as a pandemic, and it's a collision of crises in the US, and just highlighting very quickly, someone else should have talked about earlier, pregnancy and gestational diabetes, that unfortunately the US is the most dangerous place in the developed world to deliver a baby. And America's health disparities and high mortality rates are unfortunate, and looking at the fact that the US is increasing where everyone else is decreasing as far as our peer countries. So our response to this, just at ORWH and also at NIH in general, is we are looking at the most vulnerable. We are also trying to initially look at disparities and high COVID rates caused by these particular groups, and obviously looking at affected women, especially women of color, facing higher COVID responses. And it's an opportunity to tackle a lot of disparities, even thinking about obesity, because that's also kind of compounded into this whole conversation. So what we're doing, and just as one of the focal points I wanted to highlight, one of our initiatives is the Improve Initiative. That is going to be looking at contributing health conditions and social factors, and two of them being, again, diabetes and obesity. So not only mortality, but also thinking about morbidities. So the power of studying sex and gender influences. What I really want to get across and get us to start focusing on and thinking about is, unfortunately, we have been functioning for the last several decades on thinking around just the unidimensional research, and that's created some knowledge gaps. I would just state that my office was not founded until 30 years ago, but women have been around for a lot longer than that. So I just wanted to highlight the importance of us not having this default human model of thinking about a 70-kilogram white male. And we have to think about a lot of different factors that are in this, especially when it comes to women. Obviously, in a lot of preclinical research, males have been predominating as far as what has been used. And I want to hopefully change that, at least having the inclusion of both male and females as far as your rodent animals. But the thing is like, why is this? And so what can go wrong? There is knowledge that is generalized to women that might actually be incorrect. And there's been showcased that there are more adverse effects of drugs prescribed to women due to these effects. Plus, there's also little research on disease and conditions, specifically that to women. So science isn't science if it isn't reproducible, in my perspective. And I feel like most people make that and understand that. And so the NIH moved to understanding why we need to make sure science is reproducible, but also rigorous and transparent. So we understood that there was an over-reliance on male and animals and cells. There was an inattention to sex and gender effects. There was a lack of transparency and rigor in a lot of research, especially if you're doing about it in this way. And there was obviously inconsistent reporting of sex and gender specific findings in publications. But again, you might ask me like, well, why does any of that matter? So some of the consequences of not studying sex and gender is there obviously is going to be an incomplete knowledge base. Things are not going to be reproducible and replicable. So for instance, if someone else takes your data and tries to replicate what you did, they oftentimes cannot because they don't even know what you studied. There's obviously, again, a risk of erroneous conclusions. So generalizability is not necessarily the case when you're thinking about only males versus females. There's obviously a risk of harm and toxicity surprises, which we've seen. Literally 8 out of the 10 drugs that were taken off the market from the FDA, starting from 2005, were because they had more adverse effects in women. Then as obviously for us, I'm a federal agency, so we fund research, and there's a failure to maximize the return of investment of the money that we do give out. And then, more importantly to me, and we can see this even with COVID, the erosion of public trust in science and medicine is of importance to us, because if people don't trust the science and they don't trust the medicine because it's not applicable, then we have an even bigger problem. So inclusion, it's in our DNA at ORWH, and I wanted to highlight quickly, in the 1980s, NIH and Congress required researchers to include women and racial and ethnic minorities in clinical trials. This was also a mandate placed in the 21st Century Cures Act. And then I just want to highlight that some people may or may not know, have heard of what's called research condition in disease categorization, or RCDC. A lot of publications are put in that information. So I just wanted to flag that. But it garners, insights garnered from this expanded inclusion approach could enhance, again, reproducibility, and again, more importantly to me, generalizability of clinical trial studies. So another part that happened is there was a policy in 2016 that was forced, or I shouldn't say forced, it allowed our applicants to make sure that NIH had the expectation for them to consider SABV, and it will be factored into research designs, analysis, and reporting in vertebrate, animal, and human studies. And if not, there has to be a strong justification for the scientific literature, primary data, or other relevant considerations must be provided if you're only going to study one sex. So just as a quick synopsis, if you don't know about SABV, a quick checklist to see if you're doing this. And again, it's important to do this, I think, from my perspective, again, to help strengthen science, is if you're considering the influence of sex when you're formulating your research questions, when you're reviewing available literature for the influence of sex, when you're accounting for the influence of sex in your study design, you're incorporating hopefully both males and females in this. And if not, then of course a justification, it makes sense to not study females if you're studying prostate cancer, obviously. And then again, we want you to collect and analyze data and report data segregated by sex, just so people can see that. And when you're thinking about the characterization and trying to interpret your data, understanding the influence of sex versus just trying to fix it and saying that males and females will look the same. And I think, again, extremely important to communicate appropriate generalized research findings. So we're committed to this, and I'll breeze through this really quickly. We want to make sure we're integrating sex and gender in preclinical, thinking about translational, and also thinking about clinical trials, but not only in those spaces. You want to think about it when you're reporting. Also, you want to think about this from my perspective in professional education. A lot of med schools are not teaching the differences of sex and gender influences. Obviously, this has implications in healthcare and also health policy. So just quickly, ORWH is advancing the study of sex and gender influences through collaborations across NIH. NIH is the Institutes of Health. So it's not just one institute, it's a multitude. It's 27 different institutes and centers that we operate and get to work with. And so we have an R01, which many of you probably have heard of. And that's the bread and butter of NIH, but there's an R01 focus on the intersection of sex and gender influences on health and disease. We have our BIRCH, which is building interdisciplinary research careers in women's health. Also our SCORE, which is our only disease agnostic research center focused on sex differences. And then we also have some supplements. So if you have a grant already within NIH, then we can supplement it if you want to look into studying sex and gender, and obviously thinking about underserved, underreported, and understudied women. So that will be women of color, women in reproductive stage, for instance, if she's pregnant, along with also, because we know that women oftentimes are not in clinical studies, or pregnant women are not in clinical studies. In addition to that, it's also thinking about even incarceration, thinking in addition to that of rural women or women who might be in Appalachia. Just as a resource, just so everyone knows, again, because we care about these things, we have an e-learning course. And so we have our bench to bedside, which is integrating sex and gender to improve human health. And we have one on endocrinology, and there is some information that's helping to explain more around sex differences, thinking about even diabetes specifically. So I wanted to highlight that for the group. For any of you who might be interested, it's again free, so you can go there. Also, if you want to learn more about how to effectively apply and make sure you're applying the SADD policy to your grants and writing them, you have the Sex as a Biological Variable Primer. And then also just if it's introduction, if this is new to you, and I don't do a good job of explaining these things, I just want to make sure you also have another resource which has a facilitated guide, and that's the introduction to the scientific basis of sex and gender related differences. So again, if anything, I want to make sure that I highlight that the reason why I really hope that people start studying SABV or thinking about sex as a biological variable and also that of gender is it's a path to better health outcomes. If you improve design of clinical research and trials, you can also inform sex and gender aware diagnoses and treatment, and it enables individualized approaches for women and men. It fosters systematic and system-based understanding of sex and gender influences and on health and disease. So the promise to women, and I promise I'm going to go through these really quickly. If you have an intentional integration of sex and gender, women can actually get the care that they need. If you have personalized, culturally composite care at an individual level, which I'll get more into it, thinking about precision medicine soon, women then are also more believed. Oftentimes, you may or may not have heard this before, but women may or may not be believed as far as their pain symptoms and things of that nature. And so we want to change that narrative because it does present, it might look differently. And women are oftentimes, because they're not believed, are being misdiagnosed. Also, women's health is taken seriously. It's not a niche. So I think it's important for us to understand that it's half the population of this world, and so that it should be taken seriously and thinking about these issues. And obviously there's sometimes not an adequate enough of investment in women's health that occurs, and we want to also change that. So I just want to quickly highlight again, precision in personalized medicine, the right treatment or intervention for each person at the right time. We can achieve that if we base our decisions on the right research, which would include thinking about sex and gender influences. And I think learning more about the health of men and women, and not just, it's not just a woman thing. I think it's learning about both. Let us go beyond the blunt instrument of averages toward actually targeted methods and prevention and interventions. And I think it's extremely important for us to now know, and I feel like most people at this point do know, that one size will not fit all in science. And so we have to be cognizant of the different factors that do impede on these influences. And that does not make your job easier, I know, but it will obviously make it more interesting. So just quickly applying SABV in clinical practice, you can think about these things in this way. I wanted to quickly highlight that if you're thinking about precision nutrition, which I think is the most relevant to this audience, it's a framework when you're thinking about genetics, dietary habits, which was discussed earlier as well, eating patterns, circadian rhythms, health status, social economic and psychosocial characteristics, food environments, physical activity, and the microbiome. If you think about all these factors at once, then I think it's going to be extremely important for us to be able to understand what actually works for each individual as far as the actual nutrition that they do need, and obviously certain interventions that can play into this. And then I just wanted to quickly highlight that there are challenges. So accurate monitoring food and energy intake. So again, there is going to be some novel dietary adherence methods. Thinking about, someone talked about earlier, the Mediterranean diet, also the lifestyle, and then remote food photography. And then there's a scarcity of personalized approaches in higher education and curriculum for health professionals thinking about precision nutrition, because I'm sure we do know that culture has a play on what we do eat. And someone made that statement earlier that your mom oftentimes helps you to understand the different foods that you're going to like and that appetite that you're going to have later on, and there's health implications, not only just in that one generation, but transgeneration. So I just, again, want to come back to the fact that the NIH has a strategic plan on nutrition research, and the goals are: what do we eat and how does it affect us? What and when we should eat? How does it, how does what we eat promote health across the lifespan? And then how can we improve the use of food as medicine? And so I just want to quickly highlight this new program that's coming out of NIH, which is the Nutrition for Precision Health, and it's powered by the All of Us Research Program. And quickly, the All of Us Research Program's mission and objective is nurturing relationships. We're hoping to get 1 million or more participants within this cohort. We hope to catalyze and have a robust ecosystem. And it's not only just researchers that will have access to a database. The mission, again, is to accelerate health and research and medical breakthroughs and enabling individualized prevention, treatment, and care for all of us. But I want to just make sure I highlight that this is going to deliver one of the largest and richest biomedical data sets. And again, it will be easy, free to use, and safe. So just quickly, there's going to be a data browser, and in that data browser, there's going to have access, and anyone can have access to this. Just wanted to flag that. There's going to be AHR data, and there's going to be survey data. There's going to be some upcoming questions on social determinants of health social determinants of health, diet, and physical activities, along with there's going to be physical measurements in there, and those are listed, and there's going to be upcoming biospecimen data. And I just want to highlight quickly that we're hoping on all 1 million participants to have the genetic data of all of those participants and put it into this. So that would be, again, very interesting to see how all this plays out. But just for the nutrition for precision medicine, the goal specifically for this ancillary study that's coming out of this program is to develop algorithms to predict individual responses to food and dietary patterns. And we're using a comprehensive set of microbiome, genetic, physiological, metabolic, behavioral, cognitive, contextual, and EHR survey and environmental data. And it's, again, going to be a large and diverse participant pool. This is just a study overlay. I won't go into details unless someone has questions around this later. But I just wanted to end with, it's going to take a village for this to happen. The key stakeholders that are needed to reach the promise of sex and gender integration into the biomedical enterprise are in these 5 pillars. I think about as far as government. I am, a government entity, but this is not only just thinking about the US, but also international governments. I highlighted in my abstract that not only are we thinking about sex and gender policies, but so as Canada, they have the sex and gender-based analysis policy, and then the European Commission thinks through it as far as gender dimensions. And then obviously, I just want to highlight that it's not just us that are obviously involved in this. It takes academia. A lot of you guys are on the call thinking about nonprofits. A lot of people don't consider that of other entities, specifically thinking about patient advocacy, because you need to hear from the patients. Obviously, industry and business thinking about pharma and the drugs that are given. And then obviously I want to just think things like this conference. I think it's important to think about publishing our data in certain avenues in certain places. So in the future for women's health, I hope that we can raise the visibility of importance of the health of women and obviously sex and gender influences on health. Hope you can help me to get the word out about this data, strengthen connections across this enterprise, and again, amplify putting science to work for the health of women. And so if you want to connect with us, feel free to connect with me. This is my email that is here. We also have resources. We have our quarterly publication if you're interested in women's health and obviously sex and gender. Please feel free to go into this publication. We also have a monthly post, and you can click on this and subscribe. And then these are some upcoming events and past events.